Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, July 31st. I'm John Weigell here with Mark Dent, and this is the Hustle Daily Show. Organizers of the Paris Olympics are trying to make the event more sustainable than it's ever been. Part of that sustainability plan, though, has been met with some backlash from athletes. Paris's move towards sustainable food options for the Games has many athletes asking for meat, eggs, and other less carbon footprint-friendly fare. So how can everyone be happy here, and what is lunchtime like in Olympic Village? We'll get to that in a bit, but first let's give you the hits and headlines in business and tech. Starting off, JetBlue Airways shares took to the skies Tuesday morning. They're up about 17% after the airline posted a $25 million profit and said it would defer $3 billion in aircraft spending to increase their cash flow. Next, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission ruled that Amazon can be held responsible for faulty goods sold by third-party merchants on its platform, ending the company's years-long defense that it's just the go-between for customers and sellers, so they're taking some responsibility now. Over to Tesla. Tesla issued a recall on about 1.8 million vehicles to fix faulty latches that led to unintended hood opening events, end quote. It's the automaker's 9th recall of 2024. So, Mark, what do you make of Tesla's continuous recalls?
It's a lot of recalls, for one thing, more than I would have imagined. But that said, I think that the 9 of this year aren't maybe even as significant as what there was towards the very end of last year, when Tesla had to recall more than 2 million vehicles over its autopilot system. And, the Wall Street Journal actually just had some new coverage investigating those issues today. The federal government is continuing to look into that stuff as well. And I just think that, these problems are obviously just piling up. And what's interesting is that for the most part, Tesla's still been doing pretty well. Its stock, maybe isn't as high as it once was. Obviously, all electric vehicles have seen a little bit of a downswing in sales. But nevertheless, I feel like its reputation has held pretty steady. And I wonder if that's going to keep continuing.
Yeah, it has. And, all of this as Elon Musk in the past few months has kind of declared this new directive towards autonomous driverless vehicles. So it'll be interesting to see if they can't kind of shake these problems. How could they kind of dive into something completely new like that and recreate the industry from the ground up? So yeah, hoping this can all be solved.
Yeah.
Over to Mark Zuckerberg, Meta will pay the state of Texas $1.4 billion to settle a lawsuit over the tech giant's capture and use of biometric data without its users' permission. Texas is still going after Alphabet for the exact same practice. And finally, Disneyland and 4 unions representing 14,000 workers reached a 3-year contract, which narrowly avoided a strike. Good news for all Disneyland goers. Workers will receive increased pay and improved benefits, and we all love to see that. Okay, on to the main story today. Paris, as one of the culinary capitals of the world, took a different approach this year for food at the Olympics to try and reduce carbon emissions. But that has athletes asking for more meat and other nutrients necessary for peak performance. So, Mark, can you first tell us just a bit about the challenge of feeding Olympic athletes?
Well, there's obviously a lot of them.
So many.
Yeah. I mean, more than you imagine. Like, I was watching the opening ceremony, and the ship that the U.S. athletes were on in the Seine, it was basically a yacht, like a super yacht, I would say. So it's just an incredible amount of athletes who want to eat a lot of food. There's about 15,000 of them, I think, who are staying in the Olympic Village. And food has to be available around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's estimated by the Washington Post that the Olympic Village has to provide something like 40,000 total meals per day.
Yeah, and it seems like they are all housed, at least in the Olympic Village, in this kind of 3,500 people cafeteria seating setting for whenever they would require their meals, which is just a ton of people to feed at any hour of the day.
Yeah, it's like the largest cafeteria you could ever imagine. And so, as you were kind of saying in the intro there, France wanted to do things differently.
Yeah.
They've tried to do a lot of things differently. They want to have more climate-friendly meal options. And obviously that tends to mean more plant-based type of foods. So about 30% of the offerings in the village are plant-based, as well as about 60% of the concessions if you're a fan there. And so you're talking about items served in the village like twisted artichoke truffle croissants, beefless bourguignon, herbaceous chickpea pomade that is served with peas and smoked fish milk. So it's pretty like French stuff, I would say. In addition to the fact that they went for plant-based, they wanted to also just make it kind of fancy.
Right.
The Washington Post had this story about the athletes who were kind of in revolt against this, but a couple weeks ago, they did like a profile of one of the chefs who's like 3 Michelin stars rated chef who's making some of these foods. And his whole point was they wanted to bring something joyful and fun to the athletes instead of just the normal fare.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Like when you're Olympic athletes in a different country, it's a bit unfamiliar. And kudos to the French for obviously trying to make the Olympic fare more French, just to, can keep with the identity of the country. But a lot of these athletes are coming from countries with very different food. And trying to acclimate to that food is very different, especially when you have to have what you've been used to the entire time you've been training in order to perform in these events that are coming up pretty soon for a lot of them.
Yeah, there's like this weird mix that they have to hit, which is that, sure, there's people coming from all over the world who have different tastes. And then this French cuisine, and again, it sounds like really fun and exciting. And, this Michelin star rated chef is a former athlete himself. So he knows what athletes want to eat to some degree, obviously. But at the end of the day, most athletes want to just have what they have had for like the last 6 months.
Right.
And that's generally not beefless bourguignon.
Unfortunately.
Exactly. And so it's really kind of led to some frustration among the different athletes. Mm-hmm. It's kind of sad, I think, to see people condemn these menus because this chef who used to be a basketball player, his name is Alexander Mazia, he told the Washington Post that he'd studied for 2 years. He'd consulted sports medicine doctors to perfect the menu. And he, obviously was focusing on plant-based options and was doing things like avoiding rice and flour because he thought it was too hard to control at scale. And it's like, that sounds good, but also like people like rice who are athletes.
This is true.
So I think that's where the frustrations come in.
Yeah. And, there have been a few countries that have done something about this. Great Britain added a chef to its team to support athletes that didn't want to eat at Olympic Village. And the American team, even before coming over, had their own idea about how to get food and their boxed production of food for their own team. But that's, I guess, not the only issue here. Maybe not everybody is interested in eating this food. The other big issue here is what we alluded to above, that there are just so many athletes and the kitchen can get overwhelmed very easily with all of these athletes out there.
Yeah, first off, it's extremely funny that Great Britain athletes are among the loudest critics, like British people complaining about French food. That should not be occurring. Let's get that out there first.
Correct.
There must have been a little bit of spice injected into some of these dishes and they couldn't handle it, I'm assuming.
Maybe some black pepper,
right. Yeah,
things of that
exactly.
nature.
And so you're right, though. Like one of the other biggest problems isn't just the fact that these are unfamiliar dishes for a lot of athletes. It's that they're trying to serve 40,000 meals a day and there's long lines. Sometimes the food hasn't been fresh, just these other kind of smaller complaints that have been more common at Olympic Games, because this is, again, just like an extremely difficult thing to do. In the past, there were some teams who brought their own food to Beijing in 2008. That was largely over concerns about food safety. Mm-hmm. There were also long lines in Rio in 2016. And then in 2021 in Tokyo, there was just too much food, believe it or not. So it's really figuring out to get the food that athletes want and the right amount of it at the right times. It's really hard.
It seems like kind of an unsolvable problem because after so many years of the Olympics and having problems with food, it doesn't seem like this year has solved it. And even though you want to be as sustainable as you humanly can be, but it's very, very hard to do in these situations where you have everybody that wants different things, different foods. Also, there was a big drama about the lack of air conditioning at this year's Olympics to save energy, but teams responded frustratingly that they would bring their own air conditioners if they needed to. So how much can you actually make the Olympics, which is this massive countrywide event, sustainable? And it seems like there's not a lot of ways to really cut it that much.
Right. The Olympics are just not that sustainable, no matter how hard you try. And this is nothing at all against the athletes who they are in peak shape and they want to stay in peak shape. And for a human who wants to stay in peak shape, they have to do what they've been previously doing,
right?
Which for, I would assume, most of these athletes, certainly most of the Americans, sleeping in a well air-conditioned bed at night and just keeping it simple. I was actually talking to a couple of athletes just last week who they didn't make the Olympics, but they were in the Olympic trials. They're decathletes. There's very few of them who are making big money and could afford like really nice meals. So they're having very, very simple meals during their training. And it's just like eggs, box of pasta, maybe some like hamburger meats, like the cheapest kind that you can find. And you just like maximize it. You just eat as much of that as you can to just help yourself go on. And so it's got to be a huge change to go there and just to, say this for the third time, hopefully correctly, and just find a bunch of plates of beefless bourguignon. So
exactly. I was avoiding saying that this whole time. I just did not have it in me to get it.
I mean, I saw Julie and Julia a few years ago, and that was like one of the main dishes, or, a beef version of it. So hopefully I got it right.
And all the while, all of this is going on, the people that are not feeling any pain at all, quite the opposite, are NBC. You and I were talking over Slack a little earlier about just how much of an explosion this has been in viewership for NBC, and also how much the Peacock subscriptions have probably risen because of this. I'm excited to see that quarter report at the end of this year. It seems like while things are a bit dire in Paris right now over a few situations, NBC is doing pretty all right at 30 Rock.
They're doing very all right. The numbers from the opening weekend were up around 70 to 80% compared to what it was in Tokyo from 3 years ago. I think it was around 35 million viewers across all NBC platforms. On Saturday, they were averaging close to that, I think, throughout the whole weekend. And it's pretty stunning, actually. I kind of thought these Olympics would be a lot more popular than the last ones in 2021 and 2022, just because there's none of the COVID issues.
Right.
But the Olympic Games have really stood out as like these exemplars of like monoculture and the thing that that everybody else is watching. And there are fewer of those things in our society now. And I kind of thought the Olympics were maybe going to slide away to where they were just going to be really niche from now on. But, it may not be an audience like from the 90s, but it's pretty darn close. And it's very impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to do it for us today. Thanks for tuning into the Hustle Daily Show. We're a proud part of the HubSpot Podcast Network. Our editor today is Robert Hartwig, and our executive producer is Darren Clark. We've got a lot more tech and business coverage in our newsletter. If you're not subscribed, go get yourself signed up at thehustle.co/email, and we'll see you tomorrow.